and welcome to You Can Be a Doctor's UCAT preparation course for 2020. In this video we're going to be covering the decision making section, which is the newest section of the UCAT, and it's all about following rules, working with diagrams, and it's also the longest time per question section in the exam, which tells you that these questions might be a little bit more complex than in other sections. So we'll just go through a few of the questions that you might come up against in this section. The first type of question that you'll see are these drag and drop questions where you're given a statement at the top there which has a few rules, and then you're given a series of statements and you have to say whether they're true or false by dragging across the yes or no. You can also get these kind of longer questions. Again, they just have rules in them and statements, and then you're given a question to do with this statement and you're asked to say which one of these is the correct conclusion based on the rules in the passage. You can also be given scenarios or situations such as this question here, and then you're given four kind of arguments for or against that statement, and you have to say which one of these is the strongest, and we'll come on to some tips for how to work out these ones. And then finally, the Venn diagrams, which I think this section is infamous for. They can look really daunting, but hopefully by the end of your preparation, you'll become quite comfortable working with Venn diagrams, because you can see here the questions that come up. At the moment, they might look quite daunting and quite complicated, but you should become quite able to quickly work through these and get to the correct answer. But we'll go over some tips first. So the first tip I want to cover is distilling the information, because like we saw in verbal reasoning, you have to get through the questions as fast as possible to get as many marks as possible. Now in decision making, there's not a huge amount of text in these questions, but it's really dense. And sometimes there can be some extra words in there that aren't really necessary. So what is important is to distill the information in the passage, which means only taking out the useful parts and the rules from the passage. Might help to write them down, might help to make a little diagram, but you need to be getting the information to as small a packet as possible to work with. What's also really important is following the direction of logic, and this can sound a bit abstract, but what it means is you'll be given a set of rules and they happen in a certain order. So if you're told that all tennis balls are round, that doesn't mean that all round objects are tennis balls. So by making sure that you're following the logic in the correct order, it'll stop you from making conclusions that aren't actually appropriate. It can be useful to brush up on probabilities and some of the maths to do with working with Venn diagrams. None of it is hugely complicated, but it is useful to have a quick working mind for how you can compare ratios to each other and decide which one is more likely than the other, and how to just do simple addition for a Venn diagram. Now, some of the things to look out for. Obviously, you need to read the questions carefully, and in decision making, you'll often be given quantifying words, which we saw in verbal reasoning. You know, these are some, or always, or sometimes, or nobody, and it's just important that you're really clear in your mind what these words mean. Then for some of the questions, especially the argument ones, it's really important to look out for opinions or arguments that only answer part of the question. And in the exercise that we go through, we'll see one of these. So on to the first exercise. Now for this question, what I want you guys to do is pause the video and see if you can distill these two lines of text into a little word formula. And I'll highlight the groups there that we're working with. So I hope you gave yourselves a chance there to see if you could pull out the relevant information. I'll show you what I came up with here. So that distillation of the first line there, just saying that poets do not equal everybody that's at the literature festival. Second line is that poets are all authors. And then the third line there is that some poets are not writers. And so you can see that I've used some symbols there. That would just be what I would use when I was writing them down, but it's important that if you're going to take this approach of writing down the rules that come up in a passage, you've got some symbols in your mind to kind of shorthand the writing so you're not having to write out long bits of text. But we'll put this down to the side and then get onto the questions. So the first question here is asking about writers and authors, and I've highlighted the groups there just so that we know who we're working with. And it's asking that some writers were authors. Now from our second rule, we know that all poets were authors. And so from this relationship, we can look for if there's any relationship between writers and poets, because if we look at our rules, we don't actually have anything that relates authors to writers. So if we look at the last line there, because some poets were not writers, this implies that there are some poets that are writers. And because all poets are authors, that means that those poets that are writers are also authors. So the answer for this one is yes. Now don't worry if that seemed really complicated, you'll get the hang of this after a few practice questions. The next one is asking about all three groups in one. So that's saying some authors were both poets and writers. And this is very similar to the first statement because we've already decided that some of the poets were writers. And we've also decided that all of the poets were authors. So it would follow that some of the authors were poets and writers, which is why this answer is yes as well. Now for the next one, this is again looking at all three groups, but the key word here is all. So the answer before was correct because it used the word some, which gave a kind of allowance for people that didn't fit into the groups. Whereas this is saying that all of the authors at the Literature Festival were either poets or writers. And so we can see in the first line here that it says that not everybody at the Literature Festival was a poet. And so that tells us that we can't conclude whether all of the authors at the Literature Festival were poets because we just don't have that much information. So the answer for this one is no. So this next question is saying that not all of the authors at the festival who were poets were writers. So there's two kind of statements there. We know that the first one is correct, that there are authors who are poets, so that's okay. And it's saying that not all of these authors were writers. And that agrees with our third statement there, where we're told that some of the poets were not writers. So the answer for this question is true. This does follow the rules that we were given. The last question that we have to consider here is about all three groups as well. And again, it's saying that all the writers at the Literature Festival. So we should be skeptical of this immediately because it's saying that all of the writers, it's including them all together. It's saying that all of them that were authors were also poets. Now again, we can look at the first line here where it told us that some of the people at the Literature Festival were poets. So we don't know if there's extra people in here who were authors. So unfortunately the answer for this is no, because we can't conclude this from the rules that were given in the text. So that gives you an idea of these questions. These questions are worth 2 marks, but you can get 1 mark if you get the majority of them right. So it is worth kind of spending the time with these, even if you're not sure of 1 of 2 of the questions there, you can still get some marks for these. We'll go on to the next one. This is similar to the last question in the text that it gives you. It's just a series of rules about an abstract situation, but this isn't a drag or drop thing. What we're going to be given are just a series of answers. And this question can look really horrible. I'll show you the question at the bottom here because it's got loads of numbers in it. It looks like it's going to take ages. There's loads of text in it. So you would be very much forgiven for just skipping this question and coming back to it at the end. However, when we take you through this, hopefully you'll be able to see that by concentrating on the facts in it and pulling out only the relevant information, you can quickly come to an answer. So I'm going to highlight the relevant parts of this question for you, which are the 3 different types of boxes, and then the numbers of boxes in each stack. And what I want you to do is try and make some formulas for these 2 different stacks of boxes, and then a formula for the question at the bottom there. So you can pause the video now. And so hopefully you had a chance there to try and pull the information out of this into a little formula. And this is hopefully something similar to what you came up with there. So you can see that first line there is the first stack of boxes, the second line is the second stack of boxes. B being blue, red is R, and the green box is RG. And then I also came up with this as just a distillation of what the question is actually asking. So this might not help, and to be honest, it doesn't look that much nicer than the question does. But if you spend a little bit of time looking at this, you can see that there's a relationship between the 2 stacks of boxes, which are illustrated here. So the bottom stack, the second stack of boxes, actually can cancel out some of the elements of the first formula. You can see they were taking 1 blue away from it, 2 red away from it, 1 green away from it. And that leaves us with this third formula, which is 1 blue box plus 1 red box equals 25 centimeters, which is really useful because now we can take that across to our question, and that gives us a number for most of the equation, which is perfect. This also allows us to immediately exclude one of the answers because obviously we need to have a value for G, which can't be 0. So that top answer, A there, can't be correct. So essentially, G has to have a value of 8, 43, or 68, because those are the only remaining answers. And you could just guess at this point. I guess 2 of the answers are close together. One of them is on its own, so maybe you would choose the one that's on its own. But if you look back up towards the question, it gives you these total heights there for the stacks of boxes. And if you're kind of thinking about what this would look like in your mind, imagine if the green box was 43 centimeters tall or 68 centimeters tall. This wouldn't be possible because the stacks that it was a part of are only that tall. So again, that doesn't fit because you've got to fit in the red and the blue boxes in there as well. So that means that we can exclude 43 and 68 as possible answers, which means that the correct answer is B, which is 108 centimeters. So this next exercise is the kind of argument scenario questions that I talked about before, where you're presented with a situation like this that's saying that have print newspapers lost their relevance in the age of the internet, and then you'll be given 4 arguments and you need to say which argument is the strongest. There are 2 arguments for and 2 arguments against. So here are the arguments. What I want you to do is have a look at these and try and determine if any of these are opinions, and also determine if any of these only answer part of the question. Pause the video now. So hopefully you gave yourselves a chance there to have a look at these arguments and see which ones you thought were opinions or which ones you thought were only partial answers. I've highlighted this bottom one in red because that is the opinion. You can see that there isn't really any substantial argument there. It's just somebody saying something that is arbitrary. So opinions can almost always be excluded from these questions as not being the correct answer. And then hopefully some of you will have spotted that C, which I've highlighted in blue here, is only answering part of the question. You can see that the only evidence it gives is about newspapers, where it says that newspapers have a strong elderly base. That may be true, and that may be a good reason, but because it doesn't compare the newspapers to the internet, it isn't actually answering the question, which is asking us to compare news on the internet and newspapers. So that's why this C is a partial answer. So again, opinions, partial answers. Very rarely will it be the answer to these kind of questions. So we're left with A and B. Again, just for your exam theory, if you didn't have the time to choose between these, you could just choose one that's a 50-50 chance of getting the right answer, which is really good odds. But you do have the time to work it out, so we can go through them in a little bit more detail. Now looking at A, this is saying that because the internet is relatively faster, so again, faster, it's comparing it to the newspapers. And provides quick access to updated news. So that sounds fair enough. It's giving an advantage of the internet, and it's also comparing the internet to newspapers. So that's a possibility. The second answer here is saying that print newspapers offer the same information as internet news. So again, this might be completely true, but the problem with this answer is that it doesn't actually propose a reason that internet might be performing better than newspapers, because you can see it just says that the content is the same. That wouldn't be a reason on its own for internet to be succeeding, which is why A is our correct answer. Okay, on to this next question. Again, we're just going to be presented with a series of rules and we need to choose which answer is correct, but this question is made a little bit harder by having a diagram. So I'll bring in the rules now. 4 groups introduced in that second and third line, and then we've got some rules introduced in the lines after that. I'm going to highlight the relevant groups, and what I want you to do is pause the video and see if you can put these people into rooms. So if you pause the video there, hopefully you had a chance to have a play around and put these people around in that lobby and see if you could get them into rooms, and you might have figured out that it's not actually possible to put them into rooms definitively, and I'll show you why. So we'll start with the first rule there, that Meg and Adam need to be diagonally opposite. We could put Meg and Adam here, which would be diagonal, but you can also hopefully understand that we could put them here and that would still fulfill the rule. In fact, we could put them in any room and still fulfill the rule as long as the other person was on the right side of the lobby. We've put them here just to carry on with the question, but bear that in mind. This isn't the place that they have to be. This is just where we've put them. So we look at the second rule. This is about Tessa and Polly, which are going to be the green and yellow squares. Tessa needs to be closest to Meg's, and this is where the diagram comes in, because you can see that each room is closer to another room than it is to the other two, because it's a rectangle, which means that if we want one person to be closer to another person, they need to be on the same side of the hole as that person. So because Tessa has to be closer to Meg, and we've put Meg on room 1, we'll put Tessa in room 4, which leaves room 2 for Polly. So you might think, oh, this is great, that's it, that's the answer. But again, like I said at the start, this isn't the only place where these people could be. They could all be in any room and still fulfill the rules. This is just one example of a layout that they could have. So coming on to the questions now, why I've been stressing that so much is look at the first 2 questions here. They're asking us specifically about a room number. Now you could maybe get yourself in loops trying to work out if Meg is in 1 or in 3 and if that's higher or lower. But again, think about what I said. We don't know definitively where these people's rooms are because we don't have enough information. So that means that the first 2 answers can't be correct, because we couldn't put them in a specific room. So those aren't the answers. If we look at the third and fourth answer, the third one is just essentially restating statement 2 in saying that Tessa is closest to Megs, so that's a strong contender for the right answer. You could just mark that and move on. But we'll look at the fourth one, which says that Polly is closest to Tessa's. We know this can't be true because Polly's has to be closest to Adam's. So the fourth statement is false, and the third one is the correct answer. So a diagram can sometimes confuse you, but I think it can also offer kind of an anchoring for you in the question, where you can kind of play ideas in and put it onto the screen in your mind. So it might be helpful for some people to make a diagram if a question doesn't have one, but it could also be time consuming, so that's something for you to work out in practice. On to the next question. This is our first Venn diagram question. We're starting off with an easy one. So you can see we have 4 groups here. I'll highlight them there. And then they are represented in the Venn diagram using those same shapes. So I've highlighted there in green, blue, red, and yellow. Now, I don't have any particular exercise for this, but I want you to just make sure that you're understanding what is shown by these numbers and these shapes in the Venn diagram. And I'll kind of go through some little exercises after the pause. So pause the video now. So hopefully you gave yourselves a chance there just to have a look at these diagrams and make sure you understand what is being shown in the numbers and the information in these Venn diagrams. Because hopefully by the end of your practice, you'll develop this really fast working ability with Venn diagrams where you know what numbers in certain places mean. So for example, if we highlight this number here, that tells us that some people wear glasses and also drive cars. Whereas if we highlight this number here, that tells us that some people drive cars and also go to the cinema often. But you can see, because the semicircle and the rhombus don't overlap anywhere, there's nobody who drives a car and also likes pizza. And similarly, if we highlight these numbers here, they're only in one shape. So that tells us that the majority of people in this scenario only have one attribute. So that's what I mean by kind of understanding these diagrams. You need to understand what's being shown by the numbers and where they're set. So let's go into the question. These questions have a lot of text, so again, this could look daunting. You might just guess an answer and then skip it to come back later. But a tactic that I would advise for questions like this is look at the answers that have numbers in them first, because those are going to be specific, and it's faster generally to work out whether something is or isn't an exact number, whereas you can see for the first and third answers there, it just says more or less. So let's look at B first. Now this is comparing the number of people who drive cars to the number of people who like pizza. So essentially all we have to do is calculate the number of people who drive and the number of people who eat pizza. So these are the numbers for people who drive, which adds up to 26. And then we'll count up the number of people highlighted here that like pizza, and that adds up to 30. And the question is saying that car is 4 fewer than pizza, and obviously 26 is 4 fewer than 30. So B is the correct answer. And we really quickly got to the right answer there by making sure that we were giving ourselves the best chance of getting there soon. And obviously if you do the calculations, you can work out that D is incorrect and you would find that A and C are incorrect. But in the interest of time, we'll just go on to the next question. Now this last exercise is another Venn diagram question. Hopefully this will kind of test your ability of whether you understand what you're looking at. Loads of text here, there's a few groups, but I'll highlight just the groups to start with, so ignore the numbers, and I want you guys to try and put together a Venn diagram which represents the relationships between these groups. So pause the video now. So if you pause the video, give yourself a chance to put down a couple sketches on a piece of paper to come up with a possible diagram that would fit these groups. I'll show you what I came up with. I've got a red oval here, which represents all of the guests. I then got a blue rectangle, which are the guests that went mountaineering. And remember, all of the guests who went mountaineering were at the resort. That means that the blue rectangle has to be entirely within the oval. Similarly, all of the guests that went to the observatory were also guests, so they have to be within the red oval. And what's important to recognize here is that the rectangle and the triangle are overlapping. And this little area where they overlap represents the guests that did both. Again, you need to read the question carefully because you can see in the second paragraph there it says and or. So there's guests that did both. That's why the shapes overlap. And you can see in the answers here that the triangle and rectangle overlaps and there's an oval surrounding them in all the shapes. Now we can look at the numbers. So if we look first of all at just the totals, we can see that there should be 32 total and there should be 27 who did an activity. That means that there's 5 who shouldn't be within the triangle or the rectangle. And that is really good because it allows us to exclude 2 of the answers immediately, A and D, because they don't have 5 outside of the activity shapes. So we're left with B and C. Then if we look at the third paragraph, it's saying that the Hilltop Observatory should be 2/3 of the mountaineering centre. But again, be really careful reading these paragraphs. It says only visited the hilltop. That means we're looking for the numbers that are only in the shapes, so not where they cross over. And if we compare them, we can see for B, the number in the triangle is not 2/3 of the rectangle, so we can exclude that as the answer. C is our correct answer, and if you do the calculation, you can see that 6 is 2/3 of 9. Obviously, I got you guys to put together a Venn diagram there, not because I think that you should do that during the exam necessarily. It's just useful in these initial stages to make sure that you're understanding how these diagrams work. So those are some exercises. Unfortunately, we can't go into too much depth in any one kind of question because there's so many that could come up in the final exam. But certainly once you've gone through the question banks that are online, you'll have a good feel for the differences that come up. And if you stick to these tips, you'll make sure that you're coming to the correct conclusions every time. So most important thing is make sure you're distilling the information that's in the question. Don't be forcing yourself to go back to big paragraphs to find information. Next thing is to follow the direction of logic correctly. Don't make any conclusions that aren't allowed from the rules. Then make sure you're confident with Venn diagrams and you know how to add and subtract and you know what it means when shapes are overlapping or outside of each other. Learn to recognize partial answers and opinions in those argument questions because those can really quickly be excluded and they give you a good chance of getting the right answer. Avoid getting overwhelmed by questions that maybe look ridiculous and look really dense with information. Like the boxes one that had some numbers in it as well as quite a big body of text. You're well permitted to just skip these and come back to them at the end, but hopefully when you come back to them with a bit of clearer head, you'll be able to take out only the relevant information because none of the questions in this section are going to be extremely complicated. It's just that they might be presented in a way that isn't immediately obvious what you need to do. And then finally, I'll say this for every section, read the passage carefully. You need to make sure that you're looking for the right information and you need to make sure that you're seeing the nots and the always and the only words to make sure you get to the right answer. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this video was helpful. If you're struggling with any other UCAT sections, we have videos covering those. And if you have any questions after watching those, then please get in touch with us on our socials or on our email. And good luck with your exam. Does she usually drink this much?